This is my video on how good is free card draw in every card game. So earlier I made a video that was about these cards right here. A bunch of cards that say draw 2 cards on them. And people were wondering, why I didn't mention the costs of the different cards. All the cards from Magic and Hearthstone, they cost mana, and Bill here is a supporter card, which is a cost that you pay for the turn. And a lot of people said that if cards like Pot of Greed existed in these other card games, it would be completely broken. Well, I don't really think that's the biggest difference maker when it comes to actually playing with cards like this. So to prove my point here and show my example, I got a bunch of cards here with no cost, mostly, that all draw a card. Mostly. These cards, mostly what they do is you play them for very low cost, equal to 0 cost almost all the time, and they draw you a card. But the question is, how good are all these cards? Magic is the first example I want to go to, and we're talking about Gitaxian Probe. So my question to ask you is, how good is Gitaxian Probe? Gitaxian Probe is banned in basically every format, but it's not a card that is banned because you just put it in every deck. It's actually really interesting. They have another card here called Street Wraith. Now this card, you can cycle it and pay 2 life, the same cost as what it costs to play Gitaxian Probe for 0 mana, and it still gets to draw you a card. Now you may be wondering why this card's better. There's a little bit of text here that says you get to look at target player's hand in addition to the free card, and it's also a sorcery, which may seem like it's worse sometimes than being a creature, but it's actually frequently better. Cards like Street Wraith and Gitaxian Probe, not only do they make you pay the 2 life, but this can often be a benefit in decks like Death Shadow, where you want your life total to be lower on purpose. Not to mention that decks like Death Shadow love having extra information about the cards your opponent has in their hand. This way you can play out your Death Shadow when you know you're not going to die to a burn spell, or when it's not going to die to a removal spell. When the coast is clear, you can play it on your big guy. Not to mention that being a sorcery also meant that Gitaxian Probe sees tons of plays in decks that have cards with prowess or other abilities that trigger off of you casting a sorcery. So Monastery Sorcery here has prowess. You can play Gitaxian Probe in any aggressive deck. The 2 life cost matters less when you're attacking your opponent, and you also get that valuable information. You get a free card, and you get extra damage for very little cost. Now we're going to go to Hearthstone. So Hearthstone has this card Aquatic Form that lets you dredge, and then if you have enough mana to play the card, you draw the card that you dredged. Say, if you don't know what dredge does from Hearthstone, it just allows you to look at the bottom 3 cards of your deck and put one on top. Now, how good is Aquatic Form? Aquatic Form is basically like an auto-include. Now, it is a Druid card, so you can only play it in Druid, but being a card that's this good and being in the class that already has access to the mechanic that lets them get extra mana to play the cards on their turn, Aquatic Form basically was just a slam into any Druid deck, because they either played the ramp, or there were Druid decks that cared about how many spells you cast, and this card was basically a 0 mana spell that got you usually a better card than the 0 mana spell that you played that casted. Not to mention that you could even play this in aggressive decks. This card was so strong that even looking at the bottom cards of your deck on turn 2 to get a powerful 2-drop, or on turn 4 to get a board buffer like Pride's Fury here, you can do so much with Aquatic Form, and the fact that it is Druid only is probably the only reason why it was relatively balanced, because even though Druid is one of the most broken classes, Aquatic Form is just a consistency booster in their class. YuGiOh is coming up third here, and we got this card here, Upstart Goblin, which says you get the draw card, and then you give your opponent 1,000 life points. Spell card with no cost. How good is Upstart Goblin? Now, it's kind of fell off. Upstart Goblin used to see a lot of play earlier on in the game's lifespan, but as time has gone on, Upstart Goblin has gotten worse and worse, if you ask me. The life gain on the card isn't the reason why it's bad. You can basically ignore it for the most part. It doesn't really affect the game that much, but when you have other cards like Bonfire here, which just lets you search your deck for a Pyro Monster, which is an archetype that you can build your deck around, you can just get any Pyro Monster from your entire deck, so you get to pick from a toolbox of options, and it's a spell card with the same cost as Upstart Goblin. You don't even give your opponent any of the life. So you can go tutor for cards like Snake Eyes Poplar that loves being tutored, and then when you tutor this card, it lets you put it into play for free, and then you get to tutor another card. And this is kind of where the chain comes, where if you get specific elements in your deck using cards in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's actually better than drawing a random card, because you can search for something you specifically need to execute the combos that you have. This isn't even to mention that there are cards like Nibiru in the game, which really benefit from you having them in your hand on the first turn of the game when your opponent is starting to do stuff, and before you have had the option to play any of your spell cards, meaning that having a card like Upstart Goblin in your deck actually reduces your odds of getting value out of cards like this called hand traps. You would much rather play a powerful hand trap and draw that on your first turn than you would rather draw an Upstart Goblin that could possibly draw it for you later when it has basically no effect on the game. So even in the deck It's where there's only 40 cards, the least amount of cards you're allowed to play in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the card game with a standard format that has the least amount of cards in it. A card like Upstart Goblin that simply draws you one card is still not worth playing. Pokemon is our fourth and final one, and we got this card, Trekking Shoes. It kind of draws you a card unless you look at the top card of your deck and put it in your hand, which is like drawing it, and if you don't want to, you can discard it and draw a new card. And this card is an item, so it has basically no cost. How good is Trekking Shoes in Pokemon? It's like, okay, the cards... It's like fine, but you only have 60 cards in your deck of Pokemon cards, and you can't use them all for cards that are kind of fluff, like Trekking Shoes here. You have powerful draw effects like Nest Ball or like Buddy Buddy Poffin that lets you search your deck for basic Pokemon. In Buddy Buddy Poffin's case, it searches for 2 70 HP or less Pokemon, which is another thing you can build your deck around to have this card be active. So these search effects, much like Bonfire from Yu-Gi-Oh, are better than just having a random card off the top of your deck because you can get specific answers that you need. Not to mention that Pokemon, getting a basic Pokemon, you can get lots of different Pokemon with lots of different balls that are present in Pokemon, the trading card game. And you have a card like Luminion here that lets you go get a supporter from your deck from playing it onto your bench, basically functioning as both an item card, but also a card that you can search for that lets you search for, guess what, supporter cards, which are other item cards that you can use to get more cards. And you can kind of see why having this long chain of cards would definitely water down your deck if you were to put a card like Trekking Shoes in that just kind of fills spot in your deck and doesn't actually progress to your win con of getting your combo online or whatever your deck actually wants to end up doing. So in conclusion, context is really key when it's talking about card draw effects in card games, if you ask me. Cards like Divination, which were probably okay to play in like 2010, a really, really long time ago, are very comparable to cards here like Deduce, which is a card that is currently being played in standard decks in 2024. Now, these two cards, they have very similar effects. They allow you to draw 2 cards. However, the costs are a little bit different. Deduce costs a little bit more, but has instant speed and can be split up into both halves. So these costs are kind of interesting. So it goes to show that even in a power creep game where you keep pushing forward and forward, these little costs and little balancing effects, while they do change the actual ability and power of the card, it's not changed so much from the core card game that the card becomes completely unplayable or completely broken. Now, because the metagame plays such a huge element in this, even in the card games that don't have mana like Magic or Hearthstone, such as, we got Bill here from the original base set that was just an item card like Trekking Shoes where you could play it to draw 2 cards for effectively free. This card was in fact not that good in the base format just because drawing cards in the base format ended up being really bad because the best deck was a stall deck that wanted you to draw as many cards as you could, so that way your opponent would run out of cards before you did, so you wouldn't play cards like Bill to draw cards, and therefore your opponent would also not want to play cards like Bill to draw cards. Not to mention, Pot of Greed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Obviously been banned in all formats, but in the metagame where there's no cards banned, which is the only metagame you're actually allowed to play Pot of Greed in, this card sees no play in the top deck simply because it is not a hand trap, just like the problem with Upstart Goblin we saw before. You would rather play something to either make your combo instantly win on turn 1 or disrupt your opponent's combo on their turn 1 than play a card that simply says draw 2 cards. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know about the card games that you play and what cards are broken in them but are kept balanced by other game effects like being a small deck or having a lot of power in specific card effects. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this from me. Thanks for watching.